In this section, we're going to start to store data in our Firebase real-time database using the $firebaseArray service provided by AngularFire. To get us started, let's create an index.html file that includes a form that allows our users to add an object to our array of objects in our database. And that object will contain a single property called value. We also want to allow our users to be able to save and remove objects that they've previously created and added to the database. In our app.js file, we'll notice that we already have our myController function header set up, and it depends on the $scope and $firebaseArray services. The very first thing that we want to do in this controller is get a reference to our Firebase database. We do this by calling firebase.database.ref. And then we want to create a binding between a variable in our application and the array of data in our database that we're concerned with. I'm going to do this in my activate function. And specifically, I'm going to create a binding between our objs variable and the objects array in our Firebase database. Now, this objects array is a child of the root of our database, and the Firebase database uses MongoDB as an underlying data store, which essentially just stores data very much like JSON. So we can assume that there's a first-tier child called objects, which contains an array of data. But when did we create this array called objects? Well, it turns out we didn't, but Firebase is smart enough to know that if we try and reference an object or an array that hasn't been created, it needs to create it for us. And with this reference to an array of data in our database, we can then go ahead and implement the methods that we want. This is where the $firebaseArray service becomes extremely handy, because it provides very easy methods in order to be able to add, remove, and save data to our database. Each one accepts an object as a parameter. In the case of $add, it accepts a new object that we want to create. In the case of $remove and $save, it accepts an existing object in our database that we either want to remove or save. Note that each of these methods returns a promise, so in practice you'll probably want to use the then and catch functions we learned about in the previous section. But for our purposes, we just want to demonstrate the functionality of $firebaseArray, and so not calling the then or catch functions will suffice. Let's go to our browser to see these methods in action. I'm going to show our application and our database side by side in this demonstration. And take note that our database is currently empty as indicated by the null value assigned to our root property. So let's go ahead and add some objects to our database. The first object, I'll give a value of object. And then when I click add, we'll notice that our database updated with objects that has a child that contains the object with that value object. Let's go ahead and add another one called obj. And we'll see that another child is added to that objects array. So that's pretty cool. And of course, we can update these objects. So let's say I want to update the first object to be object 1. And when I click save, we'll see that the first object was updated with this new value, object 1. And finally, I can remove objects. And we'll see that this object is removed in our database as well. Something that's really interesting is that we can remove an object from our database and it will actually remove it in our application. And that has big implications because it means that there can be real-time interaction between users in our application. This is made possible because of the three-way data binding between our template, controller, and database. We learned about data binding between our controller and our template in a previous part of this course, but now with Firebase, we create a third binding with the database, and that's pretty cool.